I rented the cabin for a few days to get away from everything. Work, people, noise. It was one of those small, old cabins tucked deep in the woods, far from the nearest town. The kind you find by accident if you take the wrong turn on a dirt road and keep driving until the pavement ends. I had the address from a website where people rented out private cabins, usually for hunting or fishing trips. The photos showed a modest, weathered building with a porch and a wood stove inside. Nothing fancy, but it promised quiet and solitude. I arrived late afternoon and found the place exactly as described. A single story, rough pine boards on the outside, windows clouded with dust and grime from the last storm. A thin layer of moss covered parts of the roof. The porch creaked under my feet as I stepped out of the truck and locked the door behind me. The owner had left a key in a box nailed to a tree, just like the instructions said. No one was around. The silence was heavy. Not the peaceful kind, but that kind that feels like the forest is watching you, waiting. Inside, the cabin smelled of old wood and damp earth. The windows barely let any light through, and I could see dust floating in the air. The furniture was sparse and worn. A wooden table, 2 chairs, a small bed with a thin mattress, and the wood stove sitting cold in the corner. I stacked some firewood near it, hoping to make a fire later when the temperature dropped. I spent the rest of the afternoon unpacking my things, then went for a short walk around the property. The cabin was surrounded by thick trees, mostly pines and firs, so close that I could barely see more than 50 feet in any direction. The ground was littered with pine needles, small rocks, and fallen branches. It was quiet except for the occasional rustle of a squirrel or bird. I kept checking my phone for signal but got nothing. No surprise, I expected it. That first night, I went to bed early, hoping to catch up on rest. The cabin was cold, so I built a small fire in the stove and sat close, reading an old paperback I had brought along. As darkness fell, the forest outside turned into a shadowy wall, and I started hearing the usual night sounds. Distant owls, the rustling of leaves, maybe a deer moving through the brush. Nothing unusual. Around midnight, I was just about to turn off the light and sleep when I heard it. Footsteps on the porch. At first, I thought maybe the owner was coming by to check on the place or bring something. I called out, "Hello?" but got no answer. The footsteps stopped for a moment, then moved slowly along the edge of the porch, pacing back and forth. It was the sound of heavy boots or shoes pressing on the wooden floorboards, deliberate and slow, not like an animal or a small person running. I stayed still, listening closely. The door was locked tight, and I could see the bolt in place from where I sat by the stove. Whoever was out there couldn't get in without breaking something or having a key. The footsteps circled the cabin, moving from one side to the other, always just out of reach of the windows. Every step echoed in the silence, making the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I tried calling out again, but no answer came. The footsteps stopped suddenly, just outside one of the windows facing the woods. I held my breath, eyes fixed on the glass. The window was old and slightly foggy, but I thought I caught a shadow, a figure standing very still. Then it moved, a slow step back, and the footsteps resumed, retreating around the cabin's edge and disappearing into the darkness. I stayed up the rest of the night, pacing between the porch and the small living space, checking the locks, the windows, everything. I didn't sleep much, and when dawn finally crept through the trees, I was exhausted and jumpy. The next morning, I stepped outside to look for clues about who had been on the porch. The ground was damp with dew and soft from the previous night's rain, making footprints easy to spot. Near the porch, I saw a set of fresh prints. Heavy boots, maybe size 11 or 12. They circled the cabin, matching the pattern I had heard the night before. The strange part was what happened next. The trail led into the woods but ended abruptly about 20 feet from the tree line. The ground beyond was undisturbed, with no signs of anyone passing through. It was like whoever had been walking around the cabin just vanished. There were no broken branches, no crushed leaves, no flattened grass, nothing. I followed the prints a few more steps, eyes scanning the thick forest. There was no way anyone could have disappeared into thin air. The woods were dense but not impassable. The trail should have continued, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold morning air. My mind raced with possibilities, but none made sense. Was it an animal? No, the prints were definitely human. Someone hiding? But where and why? The cabin was isolated, with no neighbors for miles. If it was someone watching, why not make contact? I checked the cabin carefully, doors, windows, even the chimney for signs of forced entry. Nothing. No fingerprints, no marks, no disturbance inside. I called the owner's number again, but it went straight to voicemail. I packed up some gear and decided to leave a little early. I wanted to get out of that place before something worse happened. Before I left, I looked around the porch one last time. The wood was worn but solid. The hinges were tight. No sign of tampering. The footprints outside were the only clue I had, and the mystery of their sudden disappearance gnawed at me all the way back to the highway. In the weeks after, I told a few friends about what happened. Some said it was probably a hunter or a lost hiker checking the cabin. Maybe, but the locked door, the quiet pacing, and the vanished prints never sat right with me. I never stayed in a cabin that remote again. Not because I'm scared of ghosts or monsters, but because sometimes real things happen in places where no one else is watching, and some things just don't have easy answers. I'd been looking for a break from city life for a long time. Not a vacation, full reset. After months of searching, I found a listing for a cabin 3 hours out of town, just past the edge of a national forest.
No neighbors.
No traffic, just trees, hills, and quiet. It wasn't a rental, it was for sale. Cheap, it needed work, and the pictures were sparse, but that didn't bother me. I wasn't after luxury. I wanted space to think, to clear out the noise in my head. When I pulled up the gravel road, the place looked exactly like what I'd expected. Modest, weathered. It sat back in the trees on a slight slope, a single story with a pitched roof and a narrow porch out front. There was a separate wooden shed about 20 yards behind it, set closer to the treeline. Everything was overgrown. The grass was high, the siding had faded in places, and the path to the shed was barely visible. I parked beside the cabin, stepped out, and took a deep breath. The air smelled like pine needles and damp earth. It was early afternoon, and the sun was breaking through scattered clouds, casting long shadows over the trees. Inside, the cabin was bare bones but livable. A wood stove sat in the center, surrounded by mismatched furniture. A rust-colored armchair, a wooden table, a sagging couch. The kitchen was just a counter, sink, and small propane stove. There was one bedroom and a narrow bathroom in the back with a dry flush toilet. The windows were small and fogged from age, but they all locked. The front and back doors had solid bolts. I checked everything. The place hadn't been broken into or vandalized. The shed was next. The path to it was muddy, covered in leaves and pine debris. I pushed through branches and stepped over a few downed limbs to get there. It was about 10 feet wide and maybe 12 feet long, with old shingles and a warped wooden door hanging slightly open. I had to give it a hard shove to get inside. The shed smelled old, mildew, dust, and something else I couldn't quite place. It wasn't strong, just faintly sour. Inside were the usual tools: a rusty handsaw, a cracked shovel, a coil of frayed rope, a few bent nails and screws scattered across a sagging workbench. A couple of metal shelves held paint cans and jars filled with bolts. Spider webs stretched between everything. Then I noticed the floor. It was dirt, except for one corner where wooden planks had been laid out like a hatch. The wood was different from the rest of the shed. Newer, less worn. It didn't match. I knelt down, cleared the dirt from the edges, and found a metal ring screwed into the center. I gave it a pull. The hatch lifted with a creak, revealing a square opening about 3 feet wide. A narrow set of wooden steps led down into darkness. It didn't smell like a root cellar. No hint of stored food. Just that same faint sour odor, stronger now. I stood at the edge for a minute, just listening. No sounds from below. I grabbed an old flashlight from my truck and came back. The beam cut through the dark as I descended. The stairs led to a short hallway with rough stone walls. Not concrete, not brick, just old stone mortared in place. The floor was hard-packed earth. I moved slowly, the beam shaking slightly in my hand. The hallway opened into a small room, maybe 10 by 10 feet. That's where I saw the crates. 4 of them, wooden, plain, stacked along the left wall. They looked hand-built, dusty but not ancient. The floor around them was disturbed, like someone had been walking through recently. Along the back wall was a pile of dirty clothes, a twisted mess of jeans, shirts, and jackets. Nothing folded, just tossed in a heap. Next to it was a rolled-up bedroll, stained and worn through in places. It was flattened, like it had been used often. No blanket, just a crumpled jacket bunched at the end like a pillow. I kept the light low and walked slowly around the space. On the right wall was an old camp stove, cold. Next to it were 2 metal cans, beans and soup unopened. One had a 2021 expiration date. That was recent enough to make me pause. Someone had been living down here, or maybe still was. I turned back to the crates. One had the lid halfway pried open. Inside were more clothes, some folded, some not. Another held canned food, all relatively recent. One had a stack of old magazines and a weather radio. The last crate was empty, but next to it, on the dirt floor, were fresh footprints, clear in the beam of my flashlight. Not boots like mine, sneakers, smaller. I froze. They weren't my prints. They came from the tunnel and circled the crates, then vanished near the far corner. I crouched and followed them with the light. There was a slight disturbance in the dirt there, a patch that looked like it had been swept over, like someone had tried to hide something. I brushed it aside with my boot. Another tunnel, narrower, less finished. A crawl space maybe 2 feet wide, sloping deeper underground. The walls looked freshly dug. I didn't go in. Something about it made the skin on my neck crawl. I backed out of the main room, flashlight steady. Every step I took sounded too loud. The dirt floor muffled my boots, but it still felt like I was being heard. Back up the stairs, through the hatch. I shut it and slid a tool chest over it before stepping out of the shed and locking the door behind me. That night, I didn't sleep. I kept the lights off, sat in the living room listening. I had no proof that anyone was still there, but I couldn't stop thinking about how recent everything had looked. The prints, the food, the clothes. And if someone was using that tunnel, how long had they been there? The next morning, I went back with a crowbar and a camera. I didn't want to, but I couldn't ignore it either. I needed to know if someone was still inside. When I opened the hatch again, the sour smell hit stronger. I stepped down slowly, flashlight in one hand, crowbar in the other. The crates were still there, the footprints still visible, but the bedroll was gone. So was the pile of clothes. The crawl space hadn't been touched, but everything else was cleaner, tidied up, like someone had moved during the night. I snapped a few pictures and backed out. I didn't stay in the cabin after that. I packed what I could, locked up, and drove out the same day. 2 days later, I came back with a county sheriff. He didn't say much at first, just listened while I explained everything. I showed him the photos. When we got to the shed, I noticed the padlock was gone. The hatch was open. Down below, the tunnel had been cleared out completely. Crates gone, bedroll gone. Even the footprints were smoothed over. The crawl space? Still there, but now it was caved in. Dirt had collapsed into the tunnel, blocking whatever path had led deeper. The sheriff said it was probably a transient, someone living off-grid. Happens more than people think, especially out this far. But even he seemed a little off as he left. He told me the place didn't show up on any recent land records. The cabin wasn't listed with the county anymore. I never went back. I sold the property at a loss a month later. I don't know who was down there or how long they'd lived under that shed. But someone had made a home underground, close enough to hear every step I took above them. Close enough to know when I was there and when I wasn't. I had been hiking alone for almost 4 days when I found the cabin. It wasn't part of my plan. I was doing a solo loop through a national forest, staying on marked trails and designated camping spots. Nothing fancy. I just wanted some space. A break from people, emails, street noise. A break from thinking. I had a good rhythm going. Wake up at dawn, break down camp, hike 6 or 7 hours, set up again before dark. Simple. But on the fourth morning, I woke up to steady rain. Cold, persistent, annoying rain. My gear was decent, but after 2 hours of hiking, I was soaked through. My boots squelched with every step, and I was starting to feel that deep ache in my legs and shoulders. The kind of fatigue that makes everything feel slightly wrong. That's when I saw the old trail. It wasn't marked, just a thin break in the undergrowth off to the left of the main path. But it looked walked, not recently, but not abandoned either. I hesitated, checked my GPS, and saw that I was still within a few miles of the national forest boundary. I figured it was probably an old fire road or maybe a path to a hunting shack. My map didn't show it, but the idea of shelter, even temporary, was too tempting. So I took it. The trail twisted through dense pine and rhododendron thickets, gradually narrowing until it felt more like a game trail than anything else. But about 20 minutes in, it opened into a clearing, and there it was, the cabin. It looked old, but not abandoned. The roof was intact. The windows weren't boarded. A small porch extended across the front with a split log bench beside the door. There was no smoke from the chimney, no sound from inside, but something about the place felt present, like it was still used. I walked slowly up to the porch, boots slipping a little on the wet boards. I called out a greeting, just in case someone was inside. Nothing. I knocked. No answer. Then I tried the door. Locked. I leaned closer and squinted through the window. The glass was fogged from the inside, like it was warmer in there. I wiped it with my sleeve. The first thing I saw was a wooden table, maybe 6 feet from the door. On it sat a ceramic mug. Steam curled from it. Fresh. Still hot. I stared at it for a long time. There was no one in sight. The cabin was maybe 20 feet long by 15 wide. Open room. No loft. One bed in the corner. A small wood stove. Basic shelves. And that one mug of coffee, still steaming like someone had just stepped out. But the door was locked from the inside. My heart picked up in my chest. I walked around the cabin. There was no back door, just 2 small shuttered windows. I checked both. Locked. One of them had a pane cracked in the corner, but still sealed. No tracks around the place except my own, now deep in the wet soil. No footprints leading away. No tire ruts. I circled back to the porch and stood there, staring at the locked door. I jiggled the knob again, harder this time. It didn't budge. I don't know why I did what I did next. Maybe it was the cold, or maybe it was just instinct. But I stepped back, braced my shoulder, and rammed it once into the door. The frame creaked. I hit it again, harder. The third time, the old latch popped. The door swung inward. The air inside was warmer, but not by much. Just enough to fog the window glass. The smell hit me right away. Wood smoke, stale dust, and the unmistakable scent of fresh coffee. I closed the door behind me out of habit. The mug sat untouched on the table, steam still curling from it. I walked slowly around the room. The bed was made, sheets wrinkled, but no dust. There were books on a shelf, boots by the door, a half-empty pack of matches on the sill above the stove. The place wasn't just used, it was lived in. But whoever had been here wasn't here now. And the coffee, it hadn't been made long ago. I touched the side of the mug. Hot. I was already soaked and half frozen. And now I had a deeper discomfort crawling under my skin. I moved back to the door and examined the latch. There was no keyhole, just an old-style hook and loop latch from the inside. That didn't make sense. How had it been locked if no one was inside? I checked every inch of that cabin. No trapdoors, no loft, no crawl space. Just one room, for walls, and a sense of unease that wouldn't leave me. I didn't touch the coffee. I didn't sit down. I just stood there listening. And that's when I heard it. A single thump, soft but distinct, from the trees behind the cabin. Then silence. I moved to the back window and looked out. Nothing, just thick woods and steady rain. I stayed there for minutes, not moving, barely breathing. Then another sound, lighter this time. A footstep, a shift of weight on wet ground. I turned and left, fast. I didn't even close the door behind me. I moved past the porch, back down the trail I'd come from. I didn't run, but I walked hard, ignoring the pain in my knees, the sting of cold water in my boots. About 10 minutes down the trail, I stopped, just to listen. Nothing behind me, just the sound of rain and wind in the trees. But something still felt off. I pulled out my GPS to orient myself, and that's when I realized I wasn't where I thought I was. The old trail hadn't looped like I assumed. I was deeper into the woods, past the marked boundary. The track I'd followed wasn't on any map. I tried retracing my steps, but the path, which had seemed so clear before, was already fading under the rain. What had looked like a trail was now just a vague clearing between undergrowth. Every direction looked the same. I pressed on the way I thought I'd come, but after half an hour, nothing looked familiar. I kept walking, choosing whichever direction felt right. Eventually, I found another trail, rough but visible. It led downhill toward a dry stream bed. I followed that until I saw another clearing. At the edge of it stood the cabin. Same porch, same bench, same fogged window. I stopped in my tracks. I hadn't turned around. I was sure of that. I had moved in a single direction, but somehow I was back. And now the door was closed again. I walked up, slower this time. The window was fogged again. I wiped it with my sleeve. The mug was gone. The table was empty, but the matchbook was gone from the sill too. The books, gone from the shelf. The boots by the door, gone. I stared hard into the room. The bed was stripped bare. It was the same cabin, but stripped of every sign of recent life. That's when I realized someone had been watching me, and they'd cleaned up after I left. Maybe they'd been inside while I stood in the woods, watching from the back. I didn't go in again. I backed off the porch slowly, heart pounding in my chest. I left the clearing and didn't stop until I found a creek. I followed it for hours, staying downhill, slipping and stumbling but not stopping. Eventually, I saw tire tracks, then the edge of a gravel forest road. By late evening, I reached a campground and begged a ride from a couple packing up their RV. I never reported what happened. What could I say? That I found a cabin in the woods that locked from the inside and had fresh coffee on the table? I don't know who was there. I don't know how they vanished so quickly, but I know I wasn't alone. And I know one thing for sure, that coffee was meant for someone. I just don't think it was meant for me. I first heard about the cabin from a guy at work. We were in the break room, both of us tired and on our third cups of burnt office coffee. He said he and his girlfriend had stayed there years back, up in a small valley just north of Franklin, West Virginia. Said it was tucked into a hollow where barely any cell reception reached, surrounded by steep ridges and forest. He mentioned it like a throwaway recommendation, not knowing I'd been looking for a place to disappear for a few days. When I asked if it was a rental, he nodded and said it was owned by some family in town who used to rent it out seasonally. It's cheap, he told me, but you'll hear stuff about it. Just ignore that local crap. That was enough to get my curiosity going. I dug into it more that night and found a listing through a small rental site. 1-bedroom cabin, off-grid but with a wood stove and solar lights. About 25 minutes from the nearest town. The photos were basic: log siding, a single front window, small porch, tin chimney. Fire pit outside. Looked quiet. I booked it for 4 nights. The drive out there was peaceful. It was late October, the kind of time when the trees had just passed their color peak and started shedding fast. The road turned to gravel for the last few miles, with old barns and stone walls visible through the trees. The farther I drove, the more alone I felt. When I finally pulled up to the cabin, the light was going out of the sky and the air had that early winter bite to it. The place looked mostly like the photos, maybe a little more weathered. The siding was grayer, the window more clouded, but it looked solid. The firewood rack was stocked, and the key was in the agreed spot, under a stone by the steps. The first night passed without much issue. I lit a fire, cracked open a can of chili, and unpacked what I needed. There was no cell reception, no Wi-Fi, no neighbors in sight. I settled in with a paperback and drifted off on the creaky bed just after 10. The smell hit me around 3 in the morning. I woke up confused. thinking maybe something in the stove had burned wrong, but it wasn't smoke. It was sharp, chemical, and deeply unpleasant. It reminded me of when my high school biology teacher kept specimens in glass jars, preserved things with bloated skin and cloudy eyes. It smelled like formaldehyde. I sat up, blinking in the dark, half dizzy from how strong it was. It didn't make any sense. I'd only burned dry firewood and paper. The fire was down to coals. I sniffed around the stove, the floor, the windows. Nothing obvious. Eventually, I chalked it up to some chemical-soaked wood or maybe something in the old walls, and I went back to bed with my hoodie pulled over my nose. The smell faded after another hour or so, and I finally fell asleep. The next morning, it still lingered faintly in the air, but not strong enough to bother me much. I figured it had been in my head. Maybe something soaked into the old beams from a previous owner or some varnish reacting to the heat. But when I stepped outside, I found something that pulled me up short. In the fire pit, under a light layer of cold ash, were small, white paper tags. I figured they were just burnt trash at first, but when I nudged one out with a stick, I could read faint, printed lines on it. There was a name, a date, and a small punch hole. They were toe tags. Medical toe tags, the kind you see on morgue bodies. Yellowed, fragile. 3 of them in total. I stood there staring at them, unsure what to do. They looked old, but not ancient, like they'd been burned not too long ago, but not by me. The ash over them was fine and fresh. I hadn't lit anything in the fire pit. I spent the day wandering the trail that looped through the woods behind the cabin, trying to shake off the unease. The forest was quiet, full of those early cold weather sounds. Branches creaking, leaves whispering, squirrels crashing through dead undergrowth like they weighed twice their size. But the thought kept returning, toe tags. Why would someone bring those here? That night, I left the fire in the stove burning low and cracked the window to let in fresh air, hoping the chemical smell wouldn't return. It did. This time, it was stronger, and it came with something else. A memory. I remembered reading something online years ago, a story or a post about a flood in a rural West Virginia town. It said that back in the 1960s or maybe 70s, there had been a bad flash flood in the area. Roads washed out, town cut off, dozens dead. The local funeral home was overwhelmed, and they had to store bodies temporarily wherever they could. Schools, barns, churches. Some had even been placed in a remote hunting cabin for a few nights because it had a dry crawl space and thick log walls. The post didn't name the town, but it clicked. That story had to be about this place. The third night, I woke up around 2 a.m. to the sound of dripping. I thought maybe the roof had sprung a leak, but when I got up and turned on my flashlight, the ceiling was dry. The drip was soft and slow, and seemed to be coming from under the floorboards near the hearth. I got down on my knees and pressed my ear to the wooden planks. The dripping was there, rhythmic, almost like water hitting a hard surface. There was also the smell again, stronger than before. I nearly gagged from it. It wasn't just formaldehyde now. There was something metallic under it, like blood. I pried open the small hatch behind the stove that led to the crawl space. My head barely fit through, but I aimed my flashlight and looked inside. Dirt floor, cobwebs, old beams, one rusty bucket. No source of the sound, but the toe tags weren't done showing up. When I made coffee the next morning, I found one on the kitchen counter, just sitting there, pale yellow, folded at the edges, with a name I didn't recognize. The date line was blank. I hadn't left any tags there. I hadn't even touched them since that morning at the fire pit. There were no signs of forced entry. Nothing stolen. Nothing moved. Just a tag. I packed up that morning. Whatever this place was, whoever had been here, I wasn't going to play along. I loaded the car, locked the door, and started down the gravel road. Halfway to the main road, I saw a man walking on the shoulder. He was older, thin, wearing a denim jacket and a camo cap. I slowed to see if he needed anything, and he waved me down. I rolled down the window just enough to hear him. He asked if I'd stayed at the cabin. I nodded. He said he used to do plumbing work on those hollows when he was younger. Said there'd been a flood long ago. Bad one. Wiped out half the area. Town used every dry space they had to keep the bodies cold until the water went down and trucks could reach them. Then he said something that stuck with me. They didn't mean for it to be that way, but once the smell soaks in, it never fully leaves. He didn't say anything else. I drove the rest of the way home in silence. That was over a year ago now. I never went back. Never told anyone I found those toe tags, or that I smelled formaldehyde in the floorboards. I don't think anyone would care. The listing vanished from the rental site a few months later. The page just disappeared, no warning, no longer available banner. Gone. Sometimes I wonder who goes up there now. If the family still rents it quietly, through word of mouth, ignoring the old talk from town. And sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I think about that bucket under the cabin. The dripping sound I heard but never found. The tags, the names, and I wonder how many more are still buried in that soil, or how many more tags are waiting to be burned. I still remember the last name I saw on the one that showed up in the kitchen. It was my last name, and the date line was empty, still blank, just waiting to be filled in. I rented the cabin for a week in late October. I found it on a small listing site that catered to remote properties, no fancy filters, just pictures and a short description. The price was fair. The photos showed a basic wooden structure, an old wood stove, and a stack of logs outside under a lean-to. I wasn't expecting luxury, just something isolated, quiet, and without distractions. That's all I wanted, time to disconnect. Life had been piling on. Long hours, city noise, constant pressure to keep up with everything and everyone. I felt like I hadn't been alone with my own thoughts in months. So I packed up some canned food, a sleeping bag, fire starter, and my old hiking gear and made the 6-hour drive north. The last leg of the trip was a narrow gravel road that curved through dense pine forest. No signs, no nearby homes. The GPS lost signal half an hour before I arrived. By the time I saw the cabin through the trees, the sun was getting low and the cold was starting to set in. The structure was simple. One room, a low porch, smoke pipes sticking out from the roof. The front door had a heavy bolt, and the windows were clouded with age but intact. Around the side, someone had built a covered rack stacked high with firewood. Maybe 4 cords worth, bone dry and tight. The whole place had a forgotten, weathered look, but it was solid. The first night was uneventful. I got the stove going with the small logs inside, unrolled my bag on the cot, and cooked a can of soup over the fire. I read by flashlight and went to bed early. Wind scraped across the roof that night, but I slept well. I hadn't felt that kind of quiet in years. It was the second morning that I noticed something strange. I went outside to grab more firewood. The lean-to rack had 4 rows of logs, each stacked high, tightly fit. But one section near the front stuck out. Not just uneven, but oddly deliberate. The top 5 or 6 logs were set in a crisscross pattern, not like the rest of the pile. It looked intentional, too neat to be careless. I figured maybe the last person who used the place left it that way to dry, or maybe didn't finish stacking. I didn't think much of it until I grabbed one of the top logs to toss into my armload. As I lifted it, there was a snap and a sudden pull, a fast motion upward to my right. A rope snare. It whipped tight around my wrist and yanked upward hard enough to drag my arm above my head before the tension stopped. The loop cut into my skin like wire. I dropped the log and twisted, barely managing to stay on my feet. The pain was sharp, and I could feel my pulse thumping in my fingertips. The rope was strung through a bent sapling nearby, which had clearly been pulled down and anchored with pressure. When I pulled the log, it released the tension and sent the trap flying. I managed to get my hand free by bracing the line against a beam and twisting, though it tore a few layers of skin in the process. The whole thing scared the hell out of me. I stood there, breathing heavy, staring at the snare. Someone made this recently. It wasn't weathered. The rope was strong, clean. The knot work was tight and practiced. Whoever tied it knew what they were doing. It wasn't a rusty old trap someone forgot. It was fresh, functional, and hidden inside the firewood stack. That's when the alarm bells went off in my head. I looked around the clearing, eyes scanning the trees, the trail, the shadows between trunks. But it was just the same still forest, quiet and empty. No movement, No sounds but wind in the trees. I dragged the rope off the rack, coiled it up, and threw it inside the cabin. I kept the hatchet with me after that. All day I kept thinking about the trap. What was it for? It wasn't placed along a game trail. It wasn't set at ground level like a normal snare. It was triggered by lifting a log from a stack someone would obviously use. It wasn't for animals. It was for someone. For the first time, I felt watched. That night, I didn't sleep much. I sat near the stove, half dozing with the hatchet in my lap and the door bolted tight. Nothing happened. The wind blew stronger around midnight, and I heard trees shifting, creaking, but nothing else. The next morning, I walked the perimeter of the clearing. I looked for prints, signs of disturbance, anything. But the ground was too hard and dry, covered in pine needles and dead leaves. Nothing clear, just silence and cold. I thought about leaving then, packing up and heading back, but something kept me there. Maybe it was pride. Maybe I didn't want to scare myself out of the only real break I'd had in a long time. That afternoon, I decided to take a long hike. There was an old trail about a quarter mile from the cabin, barely marked. I followed it uphill through the woods, keeping track of direction carefully so I wouldn't get turned around. The forest was quiet. No animals, not even birds. It was unsettling how still everything felt. About 2 hours in, I came across another strange thing. A small clearing, natural, surrounded by young pine, and in the middle, a thick post driven into the ground. It was about 4 feet tall, split at the top with notches carved into either side. It looked like it had been used to stretch something between the arms. I saw dark stains on the wood. Next to it was a bundle of rope, fresh like the one from the snare. That did it for me. I turned back, fast, moving downhill with more urgency. I wasn't sticking around another night. The trap, the markings, the strange post in the woods. This wasn't just weird, it was intentional. I felt like I was walking out of someone's carefully arranged setup. I got back just before sunset and went straight inside, locked the door, and threw everything back into my bag. I didn't even eat. I just grabbed the hatchet and sat on the cot until dark fell. Around 7 p.m., I stepped out once to load my things into the car. It was almost completely dark. I moved quick. As I reached the trunk, I felt something under my boot shift. I looked down. Another snare. This one was ground level, half buried in the leaves next to the front steps. It wasn't there that morning. The loop had been set wide, and the rope ran toward the treeline. I stepped back, heart pounding. Someone had been here while I was gone. Someone walked right up to the cabin and laid another trap. Quiet, precise. That was it. I jumped into the car, turned the engine, and backed out hard down the path. I didn't stop until I hit pavement. I didn't look in the rear view. I drove straight through the night, stopping only once to refuel and shake off the adrenaline. Back in the city, I didn't tell anyone right away. Who would believe it? I checked the rental listing again, but it had been taken down. No contact info. The email bounced back. A few days later, I reported it to the sheriff's department in the nearest town. I didn't expect much, and I didn't get much either. They said they'd send someone to check, but I never heard anything after that. It's been months since then, and I still don't sleep right. Not because of what happened, because of what didn't happen. Because I walked into a place where someone had taken the time to set handmade traps meant to maim or capture. They'd built a post for some kind of restraint or display. They were close enough to sneak in while I was there and lay more traps. Silent, confident. They didn't make a move. That's what keeps me up. Because whoever they were, they didn't want to hurt me yet. They wanted me scared, cautious, off balance. And I think if I had stayed one more night, they would have done more than just set traps. They were waiting for the right moment, and I nearly gave it to them. I didn't expect much from the cabin. It was a last-minute rental I found through a small regional website. No frills, no modern amenities, just a square little structure on the edge of a forested stretch of land in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. The owner listed it as perfect for solo retreats or hunters and warned that there was no internet, no TV, and spotty cell service. That was fine by me. I was trying to disconnect. I'd been dealing with a few rough months. Job stress, insomnia, a breakup that didn't end well. I needed space. I wanted silence, something real and removed from everything. A place where I didn't feel like the world was climbing all over my back. The cabin was 3 miles down an unpaved road, with trees closing in tight on either side. No nearby houses. The nearest gas station was 20 minutes away. When I pulled up, I saw a simple wood frame structure with a metal roof and a sagging front porch. It wasn't much, but it was clean and dry. There was a well pump out back, a wood stove inside, and a bed with a surprisingly comfortable mattress. I unloaded my groceries, tossed my sleeping bag on the bed, and settled in. For the first few days, everything went as expected. I spent my time hiking the trails around the property, cutting firewood, and reading. At night, I kept the lantern low and listened to the wind move through the trees. It was colder than I'd expected, mid-October, and the air already had that edge that warned of winter, but I didn't mind. It was the 4th day when I noticed the first mark. I was walking a narrow trail that looped from behind the cabin into the woods and curved back around near a shallow creek. About 100 yards in, I spotted a tree with a strange symbol carved into the bark. It looked fresh. The carving wasn't deep, but it was deliberate. A single circle, maybe 4 inches wide, with a short vertical line cut through the center. Below it, a smaller half circle faced upward, like a smile. I stopped and stared at it. It wasn't graffiti. It wasn't initials or some kind of hunting mark. I'd seen a lot of those. This was different, clean, almost too careful, like it had been traced multiple times to be neat. I assumed it was some bored kid or maybe a land surveyor using symbols I didn't recognize. I didn't think much more of it until the next morning. I went out to split wood and found a second symbol. This one was on a tree much closer to the cabin, just 30 feet away from the porch. It was the same shape, same careful carving, same size. That bothered me. The woods were thick, but I would have noticed someone coming that close. I hadn't heard any cars, no footsteps, nothing to suggest someone had been near me in the night. That evening, I walked the entire area around the cabin with a flashlight, scanning every tree. I found 2 more symbols, both facing toward the structure, both nearly identical. They hadn't been there before. I started to feel uneasy. The next day, I marked the symbols with strips of tape so I could keep track. I didn't sleep well that night. By morning, there were 3 more new ones. One on a tree right at the edge of the clearing, another behind the outhouse, and one, this time, on the support beam under the back of the porch. Closer. Each mark was perfectly centered, carved at eye level, precise. I started thinking it was a prank, someone messing with me. But who would drive out to the middle of nowhere, sneak around at night without being heard, and do that? And why? That night, I stayed up with the fire going and a flashlight ready. I kept watch from inside, peeking through the windows, waiting for movement. I saw nothing, heard nothing. At 3:47 a.m., I checked the front again. There was a new mark on the porch post. I hadn't heard a thing. I didn't sleep. The next morning, I walked a wider perimeter, maybe a half-mile loop through the woods. I brought a hatchet with me, not because I thought I'd need it, but because I didn't like being out there alone anymore. I didn't find footprints, no tire tracks, no broken branches, but the markings were multiplying. One was on a fallen log. Another was etched into the surface of a large stone near the creek. Always the same symbol, always facing the direction of the cabin. That night, I locked the doors and put a chair under the knob. I turned off all the lights and sat in the corner with a flashlight and a kitchen knife. I didn't know what else to do. At some point, I must have dozed off. I woke up just after dawn and noticed it was colder than usual. I got up, rubbing my eyes, and walked toward the stove to restart the fire. That's when I saw the mark. Inside, carved into the inside wall of the cabin, to the right of the front door. Same size, same shape, same position, but inside. I dropped the flashlight. My heart started pounding. Someone had been inside while I slept. I checked every window, still latched. I checked the back door, still locked. There were no signs of a break-in. Nothing was stolen. Nothing was moved. Just the symbol. I opened the front door slowly and looked around. The snow was starting to fall, small flakes, steady. That meant tracks wouldn't last long. I saw one more symbol, fresh, clean, directly on the porch railing. That was it for me. I packed everything I could into my bag, grabbed my keys, and got into the car. I didn't stop to eat. I didn't stop to clean. I didn't even close the front door behind me. I just left. It was a long drive back to town, and I didn't calm down until I was at a diner off the highway with a hot coffee in my hand and people around me. I tried calling the owner once I had signal, but the number went straight to voicemail. I never heard back. That night, back at my apartment, I couldn't sleep. Every sound made me jump. I kept thinking I'd see a mark on the wall when I turned around. I never did. A few weeks later, I did some digging, mostly out of lingering curiosity. I looked up the county land records, found the property listed under a name I didn't recognize. I called the county office and asked if there had been any reports or issues. The woman I spoke to paused when I gave her the address. Then she said, "We don't recommend folks go out there alone. There's been some incidents." That was all she'd say. I let it go after that. But sometimes I still think about the marks, how they got closer one by one, how I never heard anything, and how someone carved one on the inside. I think that part's what sticks with me the most, because no matter how careful I was, no matter how quiet the forest was, somebody had been watching. And at some point, somewhere between sunset and sunrise, they'd been inside with me, standing close enough to cut into the wall, and I never even knew they were there. I wasn't planning on staying there more than a few weeks. The cabin belonged to my uncle. He died early last year, left behind a small property tucked away in a part of northern Michigan that most people had forgotten. He'd lived alone for the last couple of decades, and aside from a few sparse visits when I was a kid, no one in the family really went out there. He left it to me in the will, along with a handful of old tools, a beat-up truck, and a note that simply said, "Use it or lose it." I was at a point in my life where I didn't have much keeping me in the city. I just lost my job. My apartment lease was up. I wasn't ready to sign a new one. I figured a few quiet weeks in the woods would help clear my head while I figured out what came next. I packed my things, loaded up my car, and drove north. The cabin was still in decent shape when I got there. It sat about a half-mile from a dirt road that hadn't been maintained in years. Trees crowded the edges of the gravel path leading up to it. The roof looked okay. The porch sagged a little, but nothing dangerous. It was small, just one bedroom, a main room, and a narrow kitchen. There was a working wood stove and a propane tank hooked up behind the house. No internet, no cell service, no neighbors for at least a couple miles. It was exactly what I needed. There were a few things that struck me as odd right away. One was the number of locks on the doors, the windows, even inside on the bedroom door. Not just old locks either. New ones, heavy-duty deadbolts. Every window had an extra bar nailed into the frame. I chalked it up to my uncle being a little paranoid. He'd been alone for a long time. Maybe he'd had a break-in at some point. The other strange thing was the TV. It was old. One of those heavy box sets from the early 2000s with a built-in VHS player. It sat on a low wooden table across from the recliner in the main room. I didn't expect it to work. There was no satellite dish or antenna, and no reason it would pick up a signal way out there. On my first night, after unloading my bags and getting a small fire going in the stove, I tried plugging it in. Nothing. Dead screen. That was fine by me. I hadn't come out there to watch TV. But at around 2 in the morning, I woke up to sound. A low crackling hum. I got up, groggy and half asleep, and walked out of the bedroom into the main room. The TV was on. Static filled the screen, gray and black fuzz, the kind you used to see when stations went off-air. The sound was low but steady, that old white noise hum that you can feel in your bones. I stood there, staring at it for a minute. Then I walked over and reached behind the set. The power cord wasn't plugged in. I stared at it, confused. I double-checked. The cord dangled an inch above the floor, completely loose. The power outlet was empty. I stood there in the blue light, the hair on my arms slowly rising. Then I picked up the plug and pushed it into the socket. Nothing changed. Still static.
No flique.
No difference at all. Pulled it out again. Still static. That made no sense. I turned the dial on the front, switched through channels, still static. No signal. I found the power button and held it. The screen turned black. I unplugged the set again and went back to bed, heart pounding a little faster than I liked. The next morning, I told myself it was a wiring thing. Old houses do weird things. Maybe there was some kind of charge left in the set. Maybe it hadn't been completely off. I had trouble believing it, but I needed a reason. I ignored the TV for the next few days. I spent most of my time outside, chopping wood, exploring the trail behind the cabin, reading by the lake. Nights were quiet, cold. I slept early, but the TV kept turning on. Every night, sometime between 1 and 3 in the morning, I'd wake up to that same sound, that low static buzz. I'd walk out and find the screen glowing. Sometimes it would be louder, sometimes quieter, but always on, always static. One night, I left the cord draped over the screen, just to be sure. When I woke up, the static was there again, and the cord was still draped exactly where I'd left it. It hadn't moved, still unplugged. That night, I pulled the fuse for that whole section of the cabin, cut power to everything on that side, just to be sure. Same result. Screen glowing, static hissing, no power. It started to get to me. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't have anyone to tell, really, and part of me still thought there had to be some explanation. A battery backup, an old signal loop, something I didn't understand. I started sleeping with a flashlight and a hammer next to the bed, just in case. Then came the 4th week. That was when things changed. It was a Tuesday, cold. Snow had started to fall for the first time that season. I'd gone to bed early, around 10, with the fire burning low in the stove. I woke up at 2:17 a.m., like clockwork, to the sound of static. I sat up, already on edge, and stepped into the main room, and froze. The screen wasn't showing static anymore. It was showing video. At first, I couldn't tell what I was looking at. The image was dark, grainy, like it was being filmed through an old camcorder. But then I saw it. It was the cabin. My cabin. Not from inside, from outside. The video showed a grainy black and white shot of the front of the building. The camera looked like it was 20 or 30 feet away, near the edge of the tree line. The front door was centered in the frame. Snow drifted past the lens. The porch light was off, but I could still see enough to recognize it. I stared at the screen for at least a minute, unmoving. Then something moved on the screen. A shadow passed through the frame. Quick, just a flicker. I couldn't tell what it was, but it had moved from left to right, from one side of the trees to the other. Then another flicker. Closer. I didn't wait. I grabbed my flashlight and coat, ran outside, and scanned the woods. Nothing. Just snow. Just trees. No cameras.
No wires.
No footprints except mine. I went back in. The screen was static again. I yanked the TV off the table and carried it out into the snow. I unplugged everything, dropped it on its side, and covered it with a tarp. Then I locked every door and went to bed with the axe next to me. I stayed up until sunrise, then dozed off for a while. That morning, I walked the perimeter of the cabin. I looked for any signs of wires, tripods, camera mounts. Nothing. I spent hours searching. Still nothing. Then I noticed something behind the house. A trail, very faint, curved away from the back steps and disappeared into the trees. I followed it. It led about 200 yards into the woods before opening into a small clearing. In the middle was an old metal folding chair, rusted. Next to it was a dented thermos and a cigarette butt. And directly in front of the chair, angled just right, was a small tripod mount with broken plastic brackets, like something had once held a camera. I scanned the trees. On instinct, I turned around. There, hanging from a low branch, was a black cable. It led down into the snow, disappearing into the ground. I followed it, pulling gently. It ran under the surface through a shallow trench, then split into 2 cables near the edge of the clearing. One went toward the woods, the other toward the cabin. I followed that one back. It snaked through the snow, hidden by pine needles, and ended under the front porch. There, nestled in the crawl space, I found a small plastic case. I pried it open. Inside was a battery pack, a wireless transmitter, and a camera receiver hooked up to a remote signal unit. The kind used by hunters or researchers. The kind that could broadcast a signal from a mile away. Someone had rigged it to feed video to the cabin. I disconnected everything and stuffed it into a duffel. Then I followed the second cable. It led deeper into the woods, for half a mile. At the end of it, buried beneath a camouflage tarp and brush, was a collapsed tent. Inside were food wrappers, a dead radio, 2 more camera mounts, and a stack of tapes. VHS tapes, each one labeled with a date. My dates. The last one was marked tonight. I didn't wait. I ran back to the cabin, grabbed my things, and left everything else behind. I drove until I hit the highway. Didn't stop until I got back to the city. I called the local sheriff the next day and gave them the location. They checked it out. The tent was gone. So were the cables. They found boot tracks, size 12, deep tread, moving away from the property. They never found the person. I sold the cabin 2 months later. Never went back. Didn't care what they found. Didn't want to know. The only thing I kept from that place was the last tape. I've never watched it. I never will.